not supposed to. Yeah. You know, per the guidelines, and they're going to have a new booster in the fall, so maybe I should wait. I don't know. You can't get a straight answer out of anybody.
Good evening. I call the Planning Board, the Duck Planning Board regular meeting to order July 13th, 2022. It's 6:35. We were waiting a few minutes because Joe Blakaitis called and said he was en route. But what I think I will do is begin and reverse the order of some of the agenda items, and hopefully he'll be here by the time we get to agenda item 3, new business, and maybe even 4, approval of the minutes. So, with that said, again, the meeting is called to order. Are there any public comments? Hearing none, we will move to staff comments. Agenda item 5, again, we'll hold 3 and 4 for a while. Hopefully Joe will be here by the time we get to agenda items 3 and 4.
Thank you, Chairman Cofield. So we had a council meeting last Wednesday, and just a couple items of importance. The floodplain development ordinance amendment that we passed forward to them to revise the requirements for elevation certificates in shaded X zones was adopted. You can now provide a survey in lieu of an elevation certificate in a shaded and unshaded X zone to substantiate that the elevation of the structure is above the regulatory flood protection elevation, in our case is 10 feet. And then there was also authorization to publicize the zoning text amendment requesting duplexes be permitted in the C1 zoning district. And so we expect that's going to go to council for a public hearing at the August 3rd meeting. Project updates. Beach Nourishment project is still scheduled for the fall. It has been pushed back a few more weeks, so we are now looking at mobilization in late September with the actual start of construction probably mid-October. And we are still actively working on permits and approvals for the brick project. We are also still anxiously awaiting approval from FEMA for that project. There is some potential that it might get pushed back another year. We're hoping that's not the case. And we're going to start moving forward with projects that will happen this fall, such as the duck trail improvement between Blue Heron and Waxwing. I just talked to the surveyor today, and they will be providing those documents in our engineer's hands probably on Monday. So I expect some design work to be heading our way in the very near future, with bids probably being requested sometime in late July, early August, with construction in the fall or winter or up to the spring. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Sandy. I should have stated at the beginning of the meeting that Randy Morton is sick this evening and so unable to attend. He has COVID. So that's why he's not here. When we get into agenda items 3, I will read a few comments that he passed on to me today, and have passed them out to each of you, so that his input will be in front of us when we get to that item. Board comments. Any board comments, which typically happens at the end of the meeting? Hearing none, let's go to the approval of the minutes. Agenda item 4. You have in front of you in your package the minutes of the June 8th, 2022 meeting. Any comments, corrections, additions to the minutes? Hearing none, Can we have a motion to accept the minutes as presented?
Move we approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second. It's been moved and properly seconded that the minutes of the June 8th meeting be approved as presented. Any questions on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. So, we're moving through the agenda pretty quickly here. But let's see. Randy's comments are with respect to, which item is this? Lot coverage. Why don't I read into the minutes, although I gave Sandy and Kay a copy of his comments to me, but let me read into the minutes Randy's comments that he got to me earlier today. First of all, I would like to apologize to fellow board members and staff for missing tonight's meeting due to health reasons. Chairman Cofield and I thought it best for me not to be present. My comments regarding the two proposed text amendments. I encourage and applaud staff for proposing clarity to ordinances in that it makes them more understandable for folks performing the work, reduces ambiguity, and provides an accurate measurement of how the work is to be performed, and it is less burdensome to staff. In my eyes, both proposed text amendments are in line and consistent with the Ducks adopted camera land use plans as outlined in the staff report. I do have questions and recommendations for the 35% lot coverage allowance for installation of stormwater management improvements. Question, attachment A. 6D, the bottom of stormwater swales and basins should maintain 12 inches above the seasonal high water table to avoid long periods of standing water due to elevated water tables. The seasonal high water table elevation must be verified by a soil inspection by a licensed soil scientist or may be verified by a Dare County Health Department wastewater site elevation. 1. Is a Dare County Health Department wastewater site elevation performed and available for each property? If not, what are the circumstances that one is performed and what is the cost? Number 2, what are the circumstances when a soil inspection by a licensed soil scientist is required and what is the cost? Perhaps adding verbiage explaining other situations where these types of elevations inspections are required would provide additional clarity. Recommendation attachment A, 6G, the stormwater management plan must clearly delineate watersheds and drainage areas within the subject property. This should include a roof plan depicting roof runoff and the method to collect or direct the volume from each portion of the roof area towards a stormwater management system. In some situations, the plan may require a detailed topographical survey and a detailed grading plan. Can ambiguities be reduced by identifying examples of situations where a topographic survey would be required? These examples could be prefaced by adding the verbiage stating some examples include, but are not limited to the following examples. So these comments are with respect to, under new business, A, text amendment ordinance 2207, 35% residential lot coverage allowance. Sandy, would you like to begin by
Yes.
on the proposal?
So some time ago, and I'm sorry, I didn't look up when we adopted this this provision in our ordinance that allows for 35% lot coverage, but we did apply and approve a 35% lot coverage allowance with an engineered stormwater plan. And since then, we've had a couple instances, and I can't say this is overwhelming because we don't have a lot of people that try to exceed the 30% lot coverage because there is an engineered stormwater requirement, which costs money, and Mark will back me up on that, and Mike will as well. But we've had a few instances where engineers have come back and said, you know, the lot is high, it has soil such that it already can accommodate 35% lot coverage. And that's not really the intent of what we meant when we passed this, because if that were the case, then everybody would go for 35% lot coverage and use this argument. So staff is, quite frankly, looking for some clarification on what, when we ask for a stormwater management plan to go along with that additional lot coverage, what are we looking for? In our code, we've got the allowance in 3 different district regulations, which are referenced 156, 030, 031, and 032. That's RS1, RS2, and R2. And then everything is supposed to be designed to accommodate volume runoff generated by a 1.5-inch design storm, which we're having right now, right? If not more.
Yeah, probably. Easy.
They have to follow state stormwater BMPs, and they're supposed to utilize low-impact development best management practices. But our point is, you know, there's nothing in our ordinance that says this is supposed to be shown on your plan. We have some engineers that give us calculations that show us where the basins are going to be. There's no criteria in our ordinance that says, you know, how deep that basin should be, whether it has setbacks, so on and so forth. So, and there are impacts to these stormwater plans. Like, you're adding additional coverage, so we have to have some kind of verification that you're actually not negatively impacting some adjacent properties, not even adjacent properties, but adjacent properties down the street where their watershed may end up. So, congratulations.
An hour. From where?
From Sandra.
Oh, Sarah.
Why don't you drive next time?
He said he left a quarter of it.
Our Vice Chair, Joe Blakaitis, has joined us. He was caught in traffic. And for your information, we took items on the agenda out of order. And we're just beginning with item number 3, new business text amendments with respect to residential lot. We've had public comments, staff comments, board comments, and approval of minutes. So we're now on item 3A.
So that's what's happened. And then, so what staff did back in February, and I think I may have included that in the staff report, we took to council, maybe I didn't. We went to council with a memorandum of several different items that we felt were relevant and that should be considered. This was one of those items. We asked Mike Robinson, our town engineer, to review our ordinance and make suggestions as to what we might do to clarify for staff when we're processing these type of situations. And he's worked closely with Nags Head. Nags Head has a very comprehensive stormwater management requirement. Ours doesn't need to be quite as extensive. They actually have staff that implements theirs, and that's their primary focus. We don't have that, so we don't need to be as complicated. But based on Mike's recommendation, Nags Head's recommendation, Joe came up with the attached ordinance for your consideration.
A couple of questions, Sandy. One is, what is it that Nags Head does that we're not doing? And secondly, what are some of the other towns on the Outer Banks doing?
Do other towns even have?
Oh, yeah, most of them do, with the exception of Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk really doesn't have, am I on?
Yes, you're good. He's got to talk right into it.
Every town does it a little bit different. Currituck, the requirements.
I'm sorry, Mr. Robinson, just a little louder. Oh, pull the
Okay.
mic up, please.
Okay, so every town does it a little bit different. Mark, I know you're very much aware of this. Kildover Hills, depending on the size of the house, has stormwater requirements. Their requirements are 4.2 inches retained on site. Nags Head has requirements depending on whether or not you're going to use the additional lot coverage exception, I believe their additional lot coverage exception requires a 2.5-inch storm. if
Yeah,
I
and they
remember right.
only allow 33% lot coverage?
Well, it varies. It's 30% plus 300 or something like that.
Right.
Town of Kitty Hawk doesn't really have a stormwater ordinance, but Town of Kitty Hawk also does not have provisions for going over the minimum stormwater, or the maximum stormwater. You're stuck at 30% there. And they include everything, with the exception of the surface area swimming pools, which is a new ordinance that was just passed a couple months ago. They count open wood decks, they count gravel driveways. They don't give you any provisions or any reduction for pavers. Kildover Hills allows paver reductions. If you use pavers, you can take the paver coverage at 40% as long as it's installed over 6 inches of ABC, or not ABC, but graded stone. Nags Head has the same provisions. Everybody does it a little bit different. So, but I think this is a very reasonable stormwater management requirement, personally.
And that's
Mike, would you
again,
explain,
that's just again, I'm not, okay. For those situations that go over 30%.
You were using Nags Head as sort of the gold standard. What does it mean, 30% plus 300 feet, or 33%, whichever is greater?
Well, for some smaller lots, you actually get more coverage at 30% plus 300. I don't know exactly what the break is. That would be a pretty small lot, maybe like a 7,500 square foot lot or something thereabouts, where that percentage changes. So you could take advantage of either one depending on what's to your benefit. But again, that really only applies to very small lots. So.
Sandy, in the instances where interstitial storage has been used in applications to the town, has a soil scientist report been required to substantiate those? Because in Currituck County, they do allow interstitial storage, but you have to certify it with a soil scientist.
The instance that I recall that interstitial was applied, there was no soil scientist involved. And I don't believe that Joe, I can't recall. I'd have to go back to our records and see whether Joe actually approved it or not. But that's one of the reasons why we're here, is because
I understand.
There's no clarity in our ordinance. Joe said, we have typically handled these in the sense that you have to have some calculations, you have to have some kind of stormwater improvement. You can't just say that the soil is good enough to handle the 35%. And so, no soil scientists to this date.
Okay.
Currituck will allow you to use interstitial storage for your design calculations. I think their design storm is maybe 2.5 or something in that area. The problem with that, and they'll let you take the entire interstitial storage for the entire undeveloped portions of the lot and calculate a volume there, which is all fine until you have a house that's 10 foot off the property line and your roof is shedding towards your side property line. Now you're point loading that stormwater in small areas, and that water really, the interstitial storage behind the house and in front of the house really doesn't play into that, and you run the risk of overloading those soils and draining down onto your neighbor. So
I gotcha.
And that's typically going to be the case where when you're looking for 35% lot coverage, when you're maxing out your lot.
Sure, yeah.
Sandy, are these changes, if you can categorize it this way, are they primarily designed to fix sort of the loopholes where, it's all over the place, where this property owner is suggesting this and this one's something else and this one's something else? Or are we trying to tighten up the 35% requirement?
Our intent is simply to have some guidance for staff when we're interpreting this section of our ordinance. It's not, we did not come here with the intent of tightening up the 35%, but, we're talking about it, so that's entirely, if the board decides that that's a relevant issue, we can certainly take that and present that to council. That's not what we presented here, but it's a valid question, whether should be considered in light of, the rain events that we have and sea level rise and coastal resiliency and so on and so forth. But that's not the intent that staff brought this forward for.
Can you think of any instances where we've approved the 35% lot coverage that wouldn't pass, wouldn't make it with these requirements were in place?
There haven't been a tremendous number, so I'd have to go back and look at them. Honestly, we only have probably a handful that have come in with their request over 35%, and even some of them have come back and changed their plans so that they didn't have to do the swales and the basins and gone with gravel driveways in lieu of that 35%. Because again, you have that additional impact that goes typically right to the property line to accommodate those basins.
Because these requirements really aren't that tough.
They're not.
Sandy, in the staff report, you mentioned some folks applying with calculations shown and some not. Item D breaks up the percentage of each storage volume allowed for each BMP. Do we need to add verbiage that requires calculations? Because I don't see that mentioned anywhere else in the text amendment. And that was just something that you mentioned as an issue. I mean, it's kind of implied in D that you have to have some calculation to show that it's divvied up by 15%. But, and Mike, you might be able to speak to this. Is there standard language for the type of calculation that we want to see coming in on these plans?
Yeah, stormwater, when you're not taking into account interstitial storage, is simply a volumetric calculation. It's what is the volume of your open basin?
So do we need to add language that says, volumetric calculations are required? I mean, I find it hard to believe that anybody's turned in a plan without that, but it sounds like maybe yes? Just one, okay. I mean, that would be my suggestion. I don't know if we're at that point.
Yeah, if you're trying to tighten up the ordinance, I think that's a good suggestion to
I'm
have
sorry.
that in there.
Speak up.
If you're trying to tighten up the ordinance and make it consistent, then that's absolutely something you should add in there.
Okay.
Yeah, that was sort of underlying my question to Sandy, because it looks like we're grabbing at some stuff, but when, the real guidelines that people are going to use aren't in this.
So perhaps we should have stormwater plans must be prepared by a state licensed professional engineer to include volumetric calculations.
One thing about that is surveyors are actually licensed to do stormwater in
Okay.
the state of North Carolina, and some surveyors I've dealt with are actually better than engineers doing the stormwater. You might make it available to surveyors to do it as well. A lot of them won't mess with it, but they are licensed to do, drainage.
So if we add stormwater plans must be prepared by either a state licensed professional engineer or surveyor to include volumetric calculations.
Yes.
That sounds good.
Mike, did you say all surveyors are
Or,
approved?
Yeah, surveyors are licensed, part of their license is the ability to do minor drainage associated with sites they're working on. They can do culvert sizing, they can do runoff calculations. Part of the surveyor exam is actually, part of it's a rational method runoff calculation, so.
Okay. Sandy, I'm just looking for interpretation on 6H on the ordinance proposal. It says the stormwater plan is prepared by a state licensed professional engineer. And it says prior to the issuance of a certificate, a state licensed professional engineer shall certify that the proposed improvements have been constructed in accordance with the project design. Is that the same person, or do we have our representative
No.
from the town that certifies this?
That's very similar to, when we have a proposed construction elevation certificate. That's done in the beginning, and then at the end, we have a finished construction elevation certificate. Same with V-zone certifications. The same would apply here. You would have a proposal, this is what it is, and at the end, they would certify that it's been completed as proposed. And we would just change that language also to say, a state licensed professional engineer or surveyor shall certify the proposed improvements have been constructed in accordance with the project design.
But it's the
It would not be
individual or
us.
the company that prepares how it's going to be done, and they're the ones that are certifying that it was done in accordance with what they said it was going to be done?
They are certified to do this stuff. And, right now, if I get a plan, I'm typically running it over to Mike just to have him do a quick look-see to make sure it's done properly. And we can certainly add that in, but that's an added cost to the town versus, they're certifying this. Their license is on that form.
Yeah, that's not atypical at all, Tim. In fact, that's what, the engineer is not the installer. The engineer is the prescriber of what has to happen. Then the engineer does a site visit and certifies that what they said you had to do, you did.
In other towns, they require that the stormwater management be shown on the as-built. So the surveyor will pick up the swale, show the spot grades on the swale, and a lot of times they won't back verify the volumes, but they will show everything that was intended to be there with elevations and, graphically. And it's a real easy process to go, yeah, no, this has changed, or this is consistent with the plan that was originally developed.
Don't we want to do that on the as-built plans? Don't we want that shown? Isn't that a more comprehensive?
Yeah, that's where it would be.
Yeah, in order for somebody to certify it, they're gonna have to go survey it, because you got elevations you're dealing with and volumetric calculations on the swales and things like
But
that.
it's on the as-built plan? Because you said one of the other towns, as if to suggest that some don't.
No, Nags Head does a lot of their own stormwater management for residential development.
But they have their own department. That's all they do.
Right.
Like, they design them for something.
Yeah, they actually kind of design it for
They
you.
do design it for it. Unless you're going for additional lot coverage.
Right.
Then it has to be designed by a design professional. And it will have to be as-built at the end of the day. And there will have to be a certification issued.
And in these kind of situations, we're already requiring an as-built. And so, it's easy enough to say, show the swales, have your survey certified by the engineer that designed it.
So are we saying this certification will be on the as-built plans, or it's a document that must be submitted with?
I think it could be done either way. I think there's surveyors that are going to do this and probably do it on the survey. There are some design professionals or some contractors that are going to use a surveyor for one part, and then they're going to go back to their design professional for that certification. So I don't think we want to hog tie them to one way or another.
But are we saying that in the ordinance?
I think we are. It says it must be prepared by a professional engineer or surveyor. Issuance of the CO for the project must be certified by that design professional, whether it's the surveyor or the engineer. I think H covers that.
Okay.
I'd also just reiterate that in my experience, the engineer and the surveyor, neither of them have a stake in you getting your certificate of occupancy. They have a stake in you doing exactly what they said, because when people complain, they're going to complain to them. So don't think of the engineer as an ally to the developer. They're just a secondary gatekeeper with, more expertise in this area than anybody that works for the town has.
Any more comments, questions? Hearing none, will someone like to move the approval of text amendment ordinance 22-07, 35% residential lot coverage allowance?
Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion that we approve the text amendment with the addition, and that was in section H, correct?
Yes, section H, and if you could also reference its consistency with the land use plan.
So I'm saying that the ordinance is consistent with the land use plan, and that's why we're recommending its approval with the change in section H to say a state licensed professional engineer or surveyor, comma, and include calculations.
Yes, to include volumetric.
Volumetric calculations.
Yes.
Yes.
Is there a second?
I second.
It's been moved and properly second, and I won't repeat the motion, but I think everyone has it. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. And item 3A, text amendments ordinance 22-7, 35% lot coverage allowance is approved as presented and with the additions made. Text amendment ordinance 22-08, elevation of dune walkover structures. Sandy?
Okay, so this has come up because we have a couple inconsistencies in our ordinances as it relates to dune walkover structures. See, we have the dune walkover structures 156.051, which speaks to dune walkover structures when you are one, a community access, two, a private walkway. If you're sharing them between lots, you're basically exempt from setbacks. That also applies in land disturbing activities, which says that no land disturbing activity can occur within 5 feet of a property line. So there's an exception right here that we're looking at that says you can do this. It allows shared walkways and walkways in the setback, provided they're no wider than 4 feet, and so long as they're less than 12 inches above grade. That's for the setbacks. Then we also have another ordinance that applies to dune walkways. Dune walkways, we have a criteria that says your walkways have to be at least 18 inches above grade, but no more than 30. So we wanted to try and clarify when that setback encroachment is permissible and as it applies in a dune walkway situation. So what Joe's done is he's given you a lot of different information and a lot of different codes, and he didn't give you all the code information. So I kind of want to just go through some of that information. So what we're looking at changing is section 156.051, which is building features exempt from setbacks or minimum requirements. Section E and F both allow for encroachments into the side yard setback when you have one, a shared access for dune and sound access, and when you have a private walkway structure basically walking around the side of the house. We are looking at adding some language that basically says, in the case of dune walkways, they must still meet the standard that applies in our structures within the primary and frontal dunes, which requires that you have a minimum of 18 inches above grade.
And what's the maximum again?
The maximum is 30, and that's really intended to kind of keep the height from getting real high, but it's also a threshold for building code requirements. So once you exceed 30 inches above grade, you start going into a higher standard for building requirements. And that's not, it's not intentional, but it is intentional to kind of keep people from getting too deep in the weeds when they're building 4-foot wide walkway structures. So we're trying to just bring this stuff together so that it's clear when you're talking about the exceptions from setbacks for walkways and you're on the ocean front, what that criteria is. So what we're recommending is, where did that language go? That in both section 156.051 D, E, and F, that we add the line that says dune walkway structures subject to this exemption must still comply with the applicable standards found in 156.124, which says that you must be 18 inches above grade but no more than 30.
Several people have called to my attention this proposal. And I guess as I look at it, if you look at the 6 miles of duck, there is so much difference
Absolutely.
in the oceanfront property from the southern end to the northern end.
And that's primarily because of the size of the dune.
Yes. So I guess I'm stumbling through what would be the ideal for me is to let the town tighten up where it needs to be tightened up, but allow the flexibility that people need where the dune here is very different than the dune there. And that doesn't seem, and the 18 inches is what immediately draws my attention to. And I have some photos of the walkover at 122 Martin Lane in Sandalwood, where the person called it to my attention. And that walkover is shared by 4 houses that are adjacent, so I'm sure you know that. And it looks very different from the dune at my house on the southern end of it.
In what regard?
And with respect to the dune itself, this particular house out pass these around. The bottom section here, the platform and the stairs that go down, that is now totally covered by cement.
That's why we require the 18 inches too.
I'm sorry.
That's one of the reasons why the 18 inches is in place.
And I think some areas need it, and some areas don't need it. And the way the property owner talks about it, the reason it is covered by sand is because there's a structure there and there's something there. So,
Absolutely, without a doubt.
so if you look at the structure being here today and sand comes all around it, in another 2 years, it's going to be higher, and over time, it's going to get higher and higher. So again, this you cannot even see. And the dune has built up from here, and because nothing can be done with it, it is sand totally from this area down to the water, to the ocean.
Why can nothing be done with it?
Sandy, can you answer that? The property owner was told nothing, couldn't shovel it off, couldn't sweep it off.
As the CAMA LPO, I allow you to maintain your walkway up to 18 inches. So if it's filled up with sand up to 18 inches or the middle rail, you can clear it off. Once you start getting beyond that, you are excavating the dune, in my opinion, and I require that you start looking at building up and over.
And isn't that good? I mean, that's kind of what we want. In my experience, just working for clients, beach stairs are just getting rebuilt, either because they're taken in a storm or because they're buried. But my sense is that the burial is kind of what we want
If they're being
long-term.
buried, they're not being taken away. If they're being, and I will go back to 2003 during Hurricane Isabel and up through Hurricane Sandy, where we had walkways that were way out on the beach because all the sand below them had been taken out. So that's one of the reasons why we put in place Section 94 and Section 156, 124 of our zoning ordinance that kind of pulled all the walkways in, kept them tight to the dune, no more than 18 inches above, or no more than 30 inches, 18 to 30 inches. There's a requirement that the steps have to start a certain distance from the first line of stable natural vegetation. If they go down more than a 12-foot vertical rise, they've got to have a turn in them. The whole point of that is to keep them close to the dune so that if anything's going to happen to them, they're going to get buried before they get torn out. Because when they start becoming exposed, we start having liability issues. We start having structures out on the dune that could cause hazards that then become hazards to other areas on the beach. So, our goal is, if you have an oceanfront property and or you are a community that has oceanfront property, you should be looking at a maintenance regimen or have a contingency plan for elevating those dune walkways as they become covered, or look at alternatives that without them. We have a whole 1.6 miles that isn't allowed to have any beach accesses. Everything is natural. So there are other alternatives. Our goal tonight is simply to add clarification on one section of our ordinance that is inconsistent with another.
I guess my question is, can we give more flexibility in this that recognizes the difference along the 6-mile stretch?
I'm open to suggestions.
I don't have that. But what I'm looking
Yeah.
for is to not say if you're in this section of that or this, but to characterize it to characterize the condition. And based on the condition, if the condition in this area is like this, then the standard you must meet is this. If the condition in this area is this, then this is the standard you have to.
But I'm trying to understand what standard you're wanting to.
What are you trying to, what are you trying to accomplish for the beach walkover owner?
Today, the dune varies so much up and down the 6-mile stretch, and what's common for the northernmost area is not common for the southern area. So, as an example, the beach nourishment project does not extend south of the pier, and that's because it's not needed. So, putting standards in place that capture what's happening north of the pier is very different than what happened. And so my own view is I think the 18 inches is high, and it's not needed in the southern area of Delaware.
In all reality, very rarely is it a full 18 inches above the dune.
I'm sorry, say that.
It's rarely a full 18 inches above the dune when people reconstruct. Joe and I talked about that, and I was like, it's in the ordinance, and it's actually a minimal standard in comparison to other areas. Some areas require 2 feet. Some areas don't require any elevation. Some are more concerned about how high they go
Right.
versus how close they are to the dune. Now, I can go either way on the 18 inches. If we're looking at that, then we're looking at a different part of our ordinance to revise. My bigger concern is trying to be consistent. And as far as if we don't have something in there saying that you have to have some kind of elevation, then everyone's going to want to dig out their walkways. And when we start looking at dune walkways that are being reconstructed right on the sand as they exist, and then they start getting buried, then I get the calls, well, why can't I unbury this?
Sandy, don't we have to blend the replenishment area into this?
No.
We don't. That'll stand alone?
Yes.
Yeah. So the fact that the 18-inch minimum is mentioned elsewhere in the ordinance, you and Joe feel that because it says dune walkover, that the language, it's not in conflict with the 12-inch because you're saying that's west of the dune. Like when I read it, I thought it was weird that the ordinance required you couldn't be higher than 12, but you're not allowed to be 12, you have to be 18.
Only on the ocean front.
Only on the primary dune, actually.
Right.
Okay.
So if you're a soundside property, you still got to be at 12 inches.
Right.
If you're just going around your house, you
12
still got
inches.
to be no more than 12 inches.
And if you're tying into a beach access, you got to be at 12 inches until you hit that primary dune,
Right,
at which point the 18 inches kicks in.
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I see your point, and I think you could eliminate, I mean, what you don't want is to jack them way up.
Right.
So I mean,
Aesthetically, landscape-wise,
well, and I can tell you too, 30 inches, you don't have to have a handrail or like picket infill. So people are thinking about their view and wanting to hug 30 so they don't, even if they have a grab rail, it's not filled in. So, I mean.
But there are others that are like, I'm going to go to 30 because it's going to improve my view. I don't care if it's, you know.
Right, but we have the 30 max.
Can we tie it into the dune structure itself in terms of language, where the requirement kicks in? I'm not suggesting anything specific, but can the standard be tied to the dune itself?
Doesn't the height above the dune do that, though? 30 inches above the dune, whatever the shape of the dune is.
That's true, and let me use, going, in my area, there's not been a dune problem. And as you go the walkway, as you get toward the top of the dune, it's right on the sand.
Yet,
And that's not a problem, and it has not been a problem over the years.
you're also getting ready to have nourishment right next door to you.
Yes, and I do have some concern, or at least tapering off. So if I were to rebuild, and I don't want to make this all about me because it's not, I mean, the other people have brought this to my attention, then I would be required to bring it up 18 inches, when now, as you get right to the dune, it's sitting right on the dune. And, well, 2 inches for the common area. And that's not a problem.
And if you're just repairing it, then it's not going to have to
Yeah.
change.
That would only be if you tore it out and did more than 50% of the value of it.
And that's a lot of the cases that, you know, like, 'cause the 18 inches is in there, but very rarely does that actually happen because a lot of the times they're just replacing small sections of the walkway. They're not replacing the entire walkway. And in those cases, they want to raise them because they're getting covered with sand. So if they only raise them, you know, they're covered with sand now and they only raise them this much, they're going to end up having to do it again. So you have to think about the cost factor of, you know, someone that doesn't know any better. They just bought this oceanfront house and they're like, okay, my walkway is covered with sand. I want to get it elevated. I'm just going to elevate it 6 inches. Well, they're going to be doing that same thing again next year. So, you know, when we talk about 18 inches, we're talking about a whole new structure going out there. And that's not very common, one. When it happens, it's typically with new homes that are putting a new walkway out there.
So you could do any repair today to an existing walkway and not be bound by this 18-inch minimum.
It's, you know, every walkway, like you said, the beach is so different. So every walkway project, Kay will tell you, I meet with a contractor for every new walkway, every walkway expansion. Joe Blakaitis will tell you how many times I go out to Sanderling.
Too many.
You know, there's always a little give and take because it is so dynamic from one day to the next. So, you know, I'm going to go back to our original intent here was just to try and clarify some inconsistencies with elevations when we're talking about exceptions to the setback. Our intent wasn't to change the dune walkway provisions or the elevations of those. We can certainly visit that, but I think your request to kind of have some flexibility between the two lies in our meetings on site. We have to have a guide for everything, and it's very hard outside of the nourishment because that's a defined area. We can define that area and say, you can do this here and you can do this there. In the case of dune walkways, if I say the north side of town versus the south side of town, then somebody says, well, technically I'm on the north side because I'm not really in the middle of the town. So, I think trying to distinguish those things are going to be too difficult, but I think that we can, as I have done since 2006, meet with folks on site and work through the ordinance so that it works.
But if the ordinance says A, B, and C, that's what you got to really have.
Absolutely. But again, if I go out there and you're talking about a dune that's got built up like this, and it's sitting in this hole, and all they're doing is raising it 18 inches, then they're level with the dune. So, again, it's, you got to be out on the beach on a daily basis to understand what I'm saying. And, I think that, I'm sure I've been out to Martin Lane. I know that, is that 144, Martin? Or 142?
The only thing my questions beg at is recognizing the difference in this 6-mile stretch of dock, the difference in the dune structure from this area to this area to this area, and to try to tie a walkover structure to one standard. I think it might well help some areas, and it penalizes some others.
So, going back to that 18-inch standard, that's been in place for a long time. It's been in place,
It's just nobody does it.
let's see, we put, amended our ordinance in '09, and then again in 2011 and 2013. So, we've had our beach and dune management ordinance in place for some time. This 18 inches wasn't new. It's just we're trying to tie that into the exception to setbacks. If you want to bring the dune walkway elevation for a further discussion, we can do that. I'm still not sure how we can separate one standard in this area and another standard in this area. We always are going to have a little bit of flexibility when we're talking about oceanfront development because it changes.
Perhaps by tying it to what's the area for the beach nourishment called something district?
It's the beach nourishment area.
Area. I'm not specifically saying that, but that might be an area of categorizing part of for this discussion, because that is just so different. I mean, because I've got a good friend who lives on Buffalo Head, and that area is so very different than.
The beach nourishment areas can't have beach accesses.
There's nothing on the beach.
And
There's nothing on the top. Can't have it.
in the section of the ordinance that has the 18 to 30 inches
It's going up.
is not before us in the proposed text amendment. So if we want to revisit it, we could.
But that's the rule.
Yeah, the area from the core property to Skimmer Way is not allowed to have walkways.
Except the rail. Except we can do a rail.
Right. And, they can have them on the west side of the dune, but on the east side, from the static vegetation line to the berm or the recreational beach, they cannot have beach stairs.
That's interesting. So we're already recognizing that difference and applying a different standard. And so that's what I'm looking for here, recognizing the difference in some other areas and applying a
But
different standard.
the nourishment area has a designated area. It's got a map coordinate from this point to this point.
And couldn't we do the same thing here by saying outside of the nourishment area? This thing. I'm sorry. Couldn't we do the same thing here?
We could, but I don't think it's relevant because you can't have these structures in the nourishment area. So it's already separating that out.
But, I mean, it's possible we could delineate the area north and the area south of the nourishment area. But the text amendment that they're asking us to look at just deals with the walkways that go into the setbacks. So we could revisit the 18 to 30, but we don't even have language. Like, even if we wanted to delete the 18, we don't really have that language in the, we're amending 156.051. That language is in 156.124. We would have to look at a text amendment for that section. So, I mean, it seems to me like it's a this and rather than dealing with 156.124 tonight.
This and what?
This text amendment tonight, and we want to ask council to have us look at 156.124 later. 156.124 is not in the subject text amendment.
All right, what does that deal with?
That is structures within the primary and frontal dunes.
It's listed here. In the nourishment
No.
It references
Section
it, but we're not
156.124
changing
speaks to
that
structures
portion of
within the
the
primary and frontal dunes. It defines the dune system on the frontal and primary dune. It defines a dune walkover structure. It defines escarpments. It defines the first line of stable natural vegetation and the static vegetation line. It defines a post and rail structure. It defines the toe of the slope, and then it has regulatory standards related to dune walkover structures. There are dune walkover structures with A, B, C, D, and E criteria that have to be met. And then it says within the beach nourishment project, dune walkover structures must be constructed to meet the following standards. And it says on the west side of the dune. So there's a whole separate section for beach nourishment area related to beach walkover structures.
This is just me speaking. My own preference would be that we worked on it a little bit more as opposed to pushing for a vote tonight. And I'd love to go out there with you, Sandy, in different areas along the beach and see if we can come to a meeting of the minds.
Sure.
You're only going to be playing with up and down, 18 versus 20 versus 30. That's all you're going to be doing if you go out there, right?
I mean, I'm probably going to stick to my guns from my CAMA perspective in terms of my recommendation, but I am simply staff, so.
Well, it'd be educational, but that's about, still going to be within that same boxed area. So whether you vote it now or you vote it later, it's going to be the same.
Maybe, I'm not sure. I hear you, Joe. Maybe, I'm not sure. You guys talking to me? I'm sorry, maybe, but I'm not sure.
I mean, again, I would just go back to the intent of tonight's discussion was to clarify when building features that are exempt from setbacks and minimum yard requirements can be allowed and what their building standards must be in primary and frontal dune situations. So right now we have language that says they must be no more than 12 inches above grade. There's a conflict if you have something on the dune, because that says it has to be 18 inches above grade.
So you chose one over the other. Why don't you make it the 12-inch standard?
If I make it 12 inches, then I need to change two other sections of ordinance that would be inconsistent with some of the CAMA stuff. And they would also reduce the ability for dune grasses to grow beneath the structure. And increase the likelihood that you would be building up and over sooner rather than later.
What is your pleasure?
Pleasure for what?
Concluding this.
I personally would conclude it the way she's describing it, because I don't think you're going to get any better. You're going to get bigger. But her idea about growing underneath is a good thing. Because if it grows underneath, it probably could prevent some of the sand from getting there, depending on what's growing there. I don't know. I've seen so much of it that, and it's
That's
so
not the case on Bufflehead, where there is so much from the landward side of the dune, because so much sand has come up, and they still have a drop-off that's unbelievable.
And that's all going to change in a couple months.
yeah.
But in 3 years, it's going to be back there again, because the beach nourishment included that 5 years ago, and all the sand on the landward side of the top of the dune is all new. And it still drops off on the eastward side the same way it did 5 years ago.
So what do you think could change that?
I just think it begs for a little more discussion.
Which part? The ordinance 156051 or ordinance 156124 structures within the primary and frontal dunes?
Well, we're going to try to marry them, if not marry them, take out the conflict between the two. And I'm not sure if we, as we sit here, what we would conclude to do.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that one excludes the other. If it's your desire to continue to study the 18 to 30 inches with staff, the adoption of this doesn't have anything to do with that. So this just allows them some clarity for people tying into the beach accesses west of the dune.
What Mark just said, is that's not correct, right? Because it's
No.
in here.
Say it again, Mark.
The part of the ordinance that we're looking at is dealing with walkways that are allowed in the setback for various reasons, one of which is to tie into another beach access. The issues that you're asking about are in a different section that, if you studied it further and made a suggestion for a change, would be unique to that section.
Yes, but if we make this change and we reference 156051, it says, dune walkover structures subject to this exemption must still comply with all applicable standards found in 156124, it would then apply. So if we make this change today, and then we come back and we change 156124 to 12 inches, it's still going to apply.
Right, it doesn't change anything.
All we're doing now is saying that in this situation of ocean or primary frontal dunes, right now, you're going to meet the standard that's 156124. Just for clarity.
Well, I'm trying to sense, among us, my own view for purposes of emphasis is I would like to not vote on it tonight and study it, and, I'm not trying to put it off indefinitely, maybe at the next meeting. So with some more, work between Sandy and me to get to a meeting of the minds. But that's just my view.
Just a quick question, if we do that, does time affect you?
Of course.
I mean, is something you'd rather get done now than a month from now?
Probably not in the next few days, for sure.
I'm just,
We'll have to schedule something. And the question would then be, should it be a scheduled meeting with the planning board as a whole?
why can't we do what you're proposing now and then, and still do what you, yeah.
You won't be.
She doesn't gonna mind changing it.
We won't have to come back and change the ordinance that we're amending tonight. The change will be, because this ordinance references 156, 124, it would just happen.
Correct.
Yeah.
So what I would envision is if the planning board chose to recommend approval of this zoning ordinance to council, we will take that to council, requesting authorization for public hearing. We can include in the planning board transmittal letter that Chairman Cofield and other members, if you agree, would like us to review Chapter 94 of the Code of Ordinances, as well as the Section 156.124 structures within the primary frontal dunes, specific to the elevation of dune walkways being required to be at least 18 inches above the dune.
Right.
I think that makes more sense.
Okay.
I really do.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the ordinance 22-08, the proposed text amendment.
I would second that.
It's been moved and properly seconded that the proposed text amendment be approved. Any discussion on the motion?
Do we vote first and then add the language that we want to transmit, or do we add the language before we vote?
Let's incorporate it in the vote.
Okay. So I'll amend my motion to communicate to council with our recommendation of approval that subsection 156.124 is revisited
And Chapter 94.
and Chapter 94 with members of the planning board and staff.
And the motion is consistent with the land use plan.
And the motion is consistent with the land use. I really feel that way deeply. Okay.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, nay. It carries. It's in order. What carries? The motion. Okay. It's done.
And James, you opposed?
No, he
James, was it 4-0 or did you oppose? Okay.
we're a consensus building body here. Planning board.
Whew. Working me on my first one.
Just got to talk our way through it.
And just to repeat before I adjourn the meeting, we've already covered approval of the minutes. We've had staff comments. We've had board comments. And we've just concluded with our vice chair present, 3A on the agenda, new business.
Chairman Cofield, I did forget one item. We did receive on Friday the revised Resort Realty application, so we can anticipate that will be coming to you at the August Planning Board meeting.
Okay. Thank you. May I have a motion to?
I move that we
adjourn?
adjourn.
It's been moved and doesn't really need a second, but.
Second.
Let's second and it's done. Thank you.
Thank you.